A lone rancher fights through a
We
snowstorm
did not ask for your
until
help.
a lodge door opens. Three
This
Lakota
is our
sisters
home.
stand in the firelight, and his life will never be the same. The first flakes came quietly, swirling down from
Who's
the
there?
black belly of the
I
sky.
mean, no harm.
Elias Monroe leaned low in the saddle, tugging his coat tighter against the wind. The mountain trail ahead was already half swallowed in snow, the pines groaning under their burden of white. He knew he should have turned back hours ago. Pride and stubborn youth had driven him higher, chasing strays from his father's ranch, but now the land itself seemed intent on swallowing him whole. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. Elias coughed, the air burning his throat with every breath. His horse shivered beneath him, sides heaving, hooves slipping against rock glazed with ice. He whispered soft encouragement, though he could barely hear his own voice above the storm's rising howl. By the time the mare stumbled and pitched to her knees, Elias knew he'd ridden her too hard. He dragged her up once, twice, but when she crumpled again, he had no choice but to cut her free and press on alone. Snow filled his boots, biting through wool socks until his toes went numb. The world shrank to the halo of white around him, each gust of wind lashing like claws. His mind drifted to the ranch, the fire he might never see again, the stern eyes of his father who had called him soft, the empty silence of nights he had spent alone. Then through the storm, a faint orange flicker. At first, Elias thought it a trick of the eyes, but no. It was firelight, a warm glow leaking between logs stacked into the shape of a lodge. He stumbled toward it, half frozen, his legs refusing to move in straight lines. When his fist struck the wooden door, it was more a fall than a knock. The door opened. 3 figures stood in the glow of firelight, shadows shifting against walls hung with furs and feathers. The first, tall, her hair braided with hawk feathers, her eyes sharp as flint, held a knife at her side. Ayoka, though Elias did not yet know her name. Behind her stood another, gentler in face, with eyes like pools of dark water and lips, pressed tight as though holding back words, Winona. And to the left, leaning against the doorframe, was the youngest, narrow eyes filled with fire, shoulders squared like a warrior ready to strike, Chenoa. Elias swayed in their doorway, breath clouding the air. His coat was stiff with snow, his hair plastered to his brow. I mean no harm, he rasped, though the words barely carried. For a moment, silence. Only the crack of the fire inside, the whisper of the storm pressing against the walls. Then, Ayoka lowered the knife just slightly. "Come in before you die," she said, her voice hard as stone but not without mercy. Elias staggered past them, nearly collapsing onto the fur-strewn floor. The warmth hit him like a blow, bringing both pain and relief. His eyes darted between the sisters, 3 women alone in the mountains, offering shelter to a stranger they had every reason to hate. They watched him as though he were a wolf at their fire, and perhaps, in some ways, he was. The flames licked high in the stone hearth, throwing shadows across the lodge walls, where animal hides hung like silent witnesses to years of survival. Elias sat hunched on a low stool, steam rising from his wet coat as it thawed. His hands shook, partly from the cold, partly from the weight of 3 pairs of eyes fixed on him. Ayoka ladled stew from a blackened pot into a wooden bowl and set it before him with a deliberate thud. "Eat," she said, her voice clipped as if every word cost her patience. "Then speak. We'll see what kind of man comes crawling into our fire." Elias lifted the spoon slowly, conscious of their stares. The broth was rich with venison and root vegetables, but every swallow felt heavy. He had never been this close to Lakota before, never inside their home, never breathing the same smoke, never so aware of how his people's presence on these lands had turned them into enemies. Chenoa leaned against the far wall, her arms crossed, the firelight sharpening the angles of her face. She didn't blink, didn't soften. "He reeks of cattle and gunpowder," she muttered in Lakota. "Winona," seated near the fire with her hands folded, shot her sister a warning glance. "And yet he shivers like a lost boy," she answered in the same tongue. Elias caught none of their words, only the tones, sharpness, caution, and something quieter beneath it. "I didn't come looking for trouble," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, his throat raw from the storm. "My horse went down in the snow. If I hadn't found your fire—" He let the words trail. The truth didn't need finishing. Ayoka's eyes narrowed. She was older than the others, not in years, but in the way she carried herself. Shoulders squared from burden, hands steady from doing what others could not. "Your people bring trouble whether they look for it or not," she said flatly. Elias lowered his gaze. He had no defense against that. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the smoke hole above. Outside, the wind screamed like a wounded animal. Inside, silence stretched taut as a rope pulled at both ends. At last, Winona spoke. Her voice was softer than her sister's, though edged with grief that had settled deep into her. "Where is your family, rancher?" Elias's mouth twitched. "On a spread south of the Tongue River. My father—" He hesitated, shame pressing on his chest. "He runs the cattle. I've never been much use to him." Chenoa scoffed. "Then why are you here, boy? A son of ranchers wandering Lakota? Land as if you belong?" His eyes lifted, meeting hers. There was heat there, not just suspicion, but a fire born of wounds no salve could touch. He answered carefully. "I don't belong. That's the truth. I didn't come here by choice." Ayoka studied him, her dark eyes narrowing as though trying to pierce his skin, strip him down to the bone. "And yet here you sit. Our fathers. Blood stains the dirt from men like yours." Elias's stomach turned. He remembered the stories whispered in town, cavalry raids, ranchers pushing the Lakota from their hunting grounds. He remembered the pride in his father's voice when he spoke of clearing the valley, and he remembered his own silence too cowardly to challenge it. "I never raised a hand against your people," Elias said, voice low but firm. "I never wanted what was taken. I just work the land, feed the herd, keep to myself." For the first time, Winona's eyes softened, catching the flicker of sincerity in his tone. She tilted her head, studying him as though searching for cracks in his words. "And yet your silence gives consent," she said, barely above a whisper. The words struck harder than any accusation. Elias swallowed hard, unable to answer. The fire burned lower. Shadows deepened. To break the silence, Elias spoke again, quieter, this time. "You asked about my family. My mother died when I was a boy. My father remarried once, but the woman didn't stay. He's been hard as iron since. There's no laughter in that house, no music." A memory flashed across his mind. Long, empty suppers, the scrape of forks against tin plates, his father's voice like gravel. His chest tightened. "I've lived 19 years and not once felt I truly belonged anywhere. Not at the ranch, not in town, nowhere." The sisters exchanged glances. For a moment, even Chenoa's glare faltered. Winona stirred the coals with a stick, her face half lit, half lost in shadow. "We know something of being torn from a place," she murmured. Ayoka's jaw tightened, as if holding back the memory that hovered there. "Enough," she snapped, but the word carried pain, not just command. Elias looked at her, at the lines grief had carved into her young face. Something in him wanted to bridge that distance, though he knew it was impossible. The room settled into uneasy quiet. The storm battered the walls, but inside another kind of storm was gathering, one made of suspicion, loneliness, and something more dangerous, recognition. For as different as they were, Elias and the sisters had glimpsed it, the hollow ache of being left to survive in a world that had already taken too much. And in that lodge, with snow clawing at the door and fire warming his bones, Elias felt the shift. The danger was still there, sharp as a knife at his throat. But beneath it, something else stirred, fragile, forbidden, alive. The fire burned low, casting long shadows against the lodge walls. Smoke curled upward in thin ribbons, vanishing into the night air that seeped through the cracks. Outside, the prairie wind moved in restless currents, carrying the faint scent of pine and the ache of distance. Ayoka sat cross-legged near the flames, her face steady as carved stone. Winona leaned back against a post, her eyes lowered but not closed. Chenoa stood nearest the entrance, her body taut like a bowstring, as if one wrong word might send her flying into the night. Elias, with his hat set aside and his hands still, rough from the saddle, felt the weight of their silence pressing on him. Elias's voice broke first. "I've been told," he said carefully, "that silence is heavier than words. Maybe it's true. Still, I reckon some silences are made to be broken." Ayoka's gaze lifted, steady and sharp. "Then speak, rancher. Tell us what lies behind your eyes." The words struck him deeper than she might have intended. Elias drew a slow breath, tasting smoke and memory. "My father," he began, "was not a kind man. Hard with his fists, harder with his beliefs. When the soldiers came riding through, he opened his gates, gave them cattle, water, and maps of land that weren't theirs to walk. He said it was survival. I called it betrayal, though back then my voice didn't carry much weight." Chenoa shifted, bitterness flashing in her dark eyes. "So you stood aside while his choices burned the earth beneath us." Her accusation cut, but Elias didn't flinch. "I was young. I didn't have the strength to stop him, but I never rode with them, never raised steel or gun against anyone. I ain't spilled blood, not once." For a long moment, the crackle of the fire was the only reply. Then Winona's soft voice broke the silence. "You carry shame, but not guilt." Her hand brushed lightly over her forearm where a pale scar curved like a crescent moon. "The difference matters." Elias's eyes lowered to her scar, unspoken questions rising. She answered without being asked. "The night they came," Winona whispered. "Our parents told us to run, but we did not run fast enough. Flames chased us, smoke filled our lungs, and we watched the only world we knew fall in ash. I carry what they left behind." Her voice trembled, then steadied. Not just the scar, but the silence of their voices. Ayoka leaned forward, her features lit in shifting gold. "I had to choose. Stay and die beside them or take my sisters into the dark. That night I ceased being daughter. I became mother, protector, stone wall." Her tone was iron, but her hand trembled slightly where it rested on her knee. Chenoa finally spoke, her words sharp as flint. "I watched them die. I saw the soldiers' boots crush what was sacred. Since that night, every face like yours reminds me of their laughter before the fire took it." Her stare drilled into Elias as if daring him to deny her pain. He did not. Instead, he said, "Then I reckon I'll carry that look. Better me than some man who'd use it to wound you again." The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Something shifted then. Not forgiveness, not trust, but a small crack in the wall between them. Ayoka studied him with a warrior's scrutiny. Winona's eyes softened, shadows giving way to something near compassion. Even Chenoa's anger, though still burning, seemed edged with grief rather than only fury. Elias straightened his back. His confession hung in the air, fragile as a moth's wing. "I'm no saint," he admitted, "but I am untried. I've never lain with a woman, never crossed that line." The words stunned even him, spoken aloud to 3 women whose lives were already scarred by the harshness of men. Ayoka's eyes narrowed. "Why tell us this?" "Because it's truth," Elias said, "and I figured truth was the only bridge worth building. My father made me believe a man's worth was measured by the blood he spilled and the women he took. But I ain't him. I don't want to be him. What I've held on to. Maybe it's weakness, or maybe it's all I've got left that's mine." Winona's gaze lingered on him, the firelight reflected in her dark eyes. "Innocence is not weakness, Elias. Sometimes it is strength the world does not understand. Her voice carried a warmth that sent a subtle current through the room, a quiet acknowledgement that something fragile was taking root between them. Chenoa scoffed, but softer this time. Words are wind. Tomorrow or the next, you may prove yourself. Your father's son, after all. Elias met her sharpness with steadiness. Then judge me by what I do while I breathe among you, not by his shadow. The sisters exchanged glances, silent threads of thought passing between them. Ayoka's brow furrowed, weighed by responsibility. Winona's lips pressed together as though holding back words she dared not speak. Chenoa turned away, hiding the storm in her eyes. Outside, the wind pressed against the lodge, rattling the hide flap at the entrance. The prairie seemed to listen. Elias shifted closer to the fire, the heat painting his face in copper tones. Your scars, he said quietly, are carved by fire and steel. Mine are carved inside, by shame and silence. Maybe that's why I see you clearer than I should, not as enemies, not even just as survivors, but as what I wish I'd had the courage to be. The words lingered, heavy with sincerity. Winona's hand trembled slightly as she reached toward the flames, as though seeking warmth that wasn't there. Ayoka placed a steadying hand over hers, sister to sister, strength to strength, and for a fleeting second, Elias felt something more than fear or suspicion pass between them. Something dangerous, something forbidden. The fire sank lower, shadows deepening. Yet in those shadows, truth had been spoken, scars had been shown. The night did not heal wounds, but it stripped away the masks that had hidden them. Elias leaned back, exhaustion seeping into his bones, though his eyes stayed fixed on theirs. He had stepped across a line that could not be untread. Ayoka finally broke the silence, her voice solemn. We will not thank you for truth, rancher, but we will remember it. And Elias, with a faint nod, whispered back, That's all I ask. The flames guttered low, their glow painting faces marked by grief, hope, and the faintest flicker of trust. Outside, the prairie wind howled like a mourning song, carrying their secrets into the endless dark. The night was restless. The prairie grass swayed in the wind like a sea of whispers, and the moon hung low, veiled by thin clouds. Elias stepped outside the lodge to breathe, the smoke of the dying fire clinging to his clothes. But what he saw, in the distance, froze the air in his lungs, faint lantern light moving across the dark plain. Soldiers. He ducked back inside, his boots scraping against the packed earth. There's a patrol, he said, his voice strained. Cavalry, headed this way. Ayoka sprang to her feet, her hand on the knife at her belt. You bring them here? No, Elias shot back, shaking his head. I swear it. I wouldn't. But, Chenoa cut him off, her fury like a spark against dry tinder. Of course you would. You wander in, speaking soft words, and now, look. Soldiers at our door. It's betrayal. Elias's chest tightened, the accusation striking deeper than a blade. Listen to me. If they find you here, you'll be taken or worse. I came to warn you, not lead them. Winona rose slowly, her voice calm but trembling. He could have kept it to himself, Chenoa. He didn't. That must mean something. Ayoka turned, her eyes burning with doubt. Or it means he plays a clever game. My people's blood has watered this soil because we trusted the wrong tongue. Before. The air inside the lodge grew heavy with rage, grief, and suspicion. Shadows shifted across the sisters' faces, each carrying scars of loss Elias could not erase. He stepped closer to the fire, letting the flicker light his face, his voice steady. If I wanted harm for you, I'd be riding with them, not standing here. I can draw them off and lead them astray. They won't know where you are. Ayoka narrowed her eyes. And why risk your life for us? For women you barely know? Elias's answer came low, almost like a confession. Because maybe I'm tired of running from what my father's shadow left behind. Because if I let them touch one hair on your heads, I'll be no different than him, and I'd sooner die out there on the plains than carry that shame. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Winona's eyes glistened, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Hayoka's breath caught, her fists trembling between distrust and the faint pull of belief. Chenoa's face was still carved in anger, but her voice wavered when she said, "You expect us to trust you with our lives?" Elias met her gaze, unflinching. "No, I expect you to trust me with mine." The fire popped, sending a flare of sparks upward. Outside, the sound of distant hooves drifted closer, a steady, merciless drumbeat against the earth. Hayoka broke the stillness first. "If you do this, rancher, there's no turning back. You may not live to see another sunrise." Elias nodded, his jaw tight. "Then let the sunrise judge me." Chenoa stepped forward, her voice sharp but uncertain. "And if you fail? If you lead them straight to us? Then," Elias said, his voice low, "you'll know I was never worth the trust to begin with, but I won't fail." The sisters exchanged looks, a silent storm of memories and fears passing between them. Winona finally spoke, her tone soft but firm. "Let him try. The wind carries truth better than we do. And tonight, I hear no lie. In him." Ayoka's shoulders sagged, her eyes weary but resolute. "Go then. But if your words are false, know this. My knife will find your heart before theirs ever could." Elias dipped his head, accepting her warning as the price of faith. "Fair enough." He took his hat, set it low on his brow, and turned toward the door. The prairie wind slipped in as he pulled back the hide flap, carrying with it the smell of dust and danger. Behind him, Winona's voice called, soft as a prayer, "Elias." He paused, half in shadow, half in moonlight. "Come back," she whispered. He said nothing, but the flicker of his profile in the firelight carried the weight of a promise unspoken. Outside, the plains stretched vast and merciless beneath the pale moon. The lanterns of the cavalry bobbed like restless stars, their horses snorting, their riders murmuring low. Elias mounted his own, the leather creaking under his weight. He whispered to the animal, steadying it, "Easy. Boy, we got work to do." Then, with a pull of the reins, he rode into the dark, the sound of hooves swallowed by the endless prairie. Inside the lodge, the sisters sat in tense silence. Ayoka's hand never left her knife. Chenoa's jaw clenched, though the anger in her eyes had dimmed to fear. And Winona. She stared into the fire as if it held his shadow, her lips moving in a silent plea to the night. The cavalry lights moved closer, spreading across the land like a slow tide. And somewhere between them and the hidden lodge rode a lone man, choosing for the first time not his father's path but his own. The wind rose, sweeping across the grass, bending it like waves under a storm. It carried Elias's heartbeat, the sisters' fears, and the distant thunder of approaching men into one vast, trembling silence. The night held its breath, waiting for what choice might and courage which would bring. The night broke open with the crack of gunfire. Snow sprayed from the ground like shards of glass, and the horses of the cavalry patrol snorted in panic as their riders closed in around the lodge. Inside the small lodge, Elias gripped an old, rust-pocked rifle that Ayoka shoved into his hands. The weight of it felt unnatural, heavier than iron, heavier than his own heart. He had never fired at a man before. "Stay low," Ayoka hissed, stringing her bow with swift, sure hands. Her jaw was set like stone. Winona crouched by the fire, Pitt clutching a knife, her breath shallow but steady. Chenoa slipped to the back wall where the shadows swallowed her, waiting to spring her traps. The sisters had prepared for this moment all their lives. Elias had not. The door burst inward, with the force of a boot. Snow and smoke swirled into the lodge. A soldier raised his pistol. Elias pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening, tearing through the silence, through his chest, through the air. The man staggered backward, blood soaking the snow at his boots. Elias's hands shook violently, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. He had killed, no time to think. More soldiers poured forward. Arrows whistled through the smoke. Ayoka's bow sang true, felling one man before he crossed the threshold. Another lunged inside, but Winona's knife found his ribs in a desperate, practiced motion. He collapsed, with a groan, clutching at her arm as he slid down, leaving her gasping in horror but alive. Elias dropped the empty rifle, snatched the dead soldier's pistol, and fired again. Each shot burned through him like fire. His vision blurred with the smoke, with the snow, with the impossible weight of blood on his hands. Outside, Chenoa's trap sprung. A horse screamed as it tumbled into a pit lined with sharpened stakes, throwing its rider violently into the snow. Her voice rang out fierce and wild. "Back to hell with you!" Gunfire lit the night. Muzzles flashed like lightning, casting brief, brutal pictures of chaos. Ayoka ducking behind the doorway, loosing another arrow. Winona kneeling beside Elias, pressing her sleeve against his grazed arm where a bullet had skimmed him. Chenoa dragging a wounded soldier into the snow and finishing him with the edge of her blade. The world became blood and smoke, screams swallowed by the storm. Elias's chest heaved. A cavalryman lunged at Winona, pistol raised. Elias fired without thought, the shot splitting the night. The man fell at Winona's feet. Her eyes snapped to Elias. For a heartbeat, time stilled. His hands trembled, his lips parted, his face, pale with horror at what he had done, but he had saved her. She knew it. And in that gaze, something passed between them, fragile as glass and fierce as fire. But there was no space for tenderness. Another soldier burst through the doorway, his bayonet flashing. Elias and the man collided, crashing into the fire pit. The rifle clattered, flames spraying sparks into the lodge. They wrestled in the smoke, the soldier snarling curses, Elias grunting in pain. It was Winona who drove her knife down into the soldier's back, saving Elias again. His eyes widened at her ferocity, at the blood on her hands, at the bond of survival binding them together in the most brutal way. When the last shot rang out and the last scream faded into the snow, silence returned. A silence, thick with death. The key. Sisters stood amid bodies, their breaths ragged clouds in the cold air. Blood stained their knives, their hands, their clothes. Elias sank against the wall, the pistol slipping from his grasp. His hands shook so violently he couldn't still them. "I killed them," he whispered, his voice hoarse, breaking. "God forgive me, I killed them." Ayoka's face was hard, but her voice softened slightly. "You saved her." Elias looked to Winona, who knelt beside him, her hand resting over his trembling one. Her eyes brimmed with sorrow, not for the dead, but for him, for the boy who had never killed until tonight. Chenoa spat into the snow, her body shaking with rage and exhaustion. Better them than us. Outside, the fire from the overturned lanterns had spread to the dead men's coats. The sisters dragged the bodies one by one into the blaze, their silhouettes stark against the flames. The smell of burning flesh and powder filled the air, heavy and unbearable. But it was necessary. If the patrol vanished into the storm, the rest of the cavalry would not know what had become of them. Elias joined them, his face pale, his body unsteady, but his hands steady enough to carry the dead. When the last body was cast into the fire, the four of them stood together in silence, watching the flames consume the night's horror. Snow fell thick, hissing as it met the fire. Sparks climbed into the dark sky like lost souls rising. Ayoka stood tall, her face lit by firelight, her eyes unreadable. Chenoa turned away, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. But Winona lingered close to Elias, their shoulders nearly touching, the warmth of her presence holding him back from breaking apart. He whispered, his voice cracking, "I never wanted this. Not any of it. But I couldn't let them take you." Winona's eyes glistened, reflecting both the fire and his pain. "And now you carry it with us, blood that will never wash away. You are no longer a stranger, Elias. You are bound to us." The fire roared higher, the snow melting around its base into dark, muddy pools. Elias and Winona held each other's gaze, both knowing there was something between them, something fragile, dangerous, and undeniable. But neither spoke it aloud. Not yet. The night was too heavy, the smell of death too fresh, the smoke too thick. So they stood together in silence, 4 survivors beneath the falling snow, the fire painting the storm red and gold. The first light of morning spilled over the mountains, painting the blood-soaked snowfield in gold and ash. The silence was too heavy to feel like peace. The night had been fire and thunder. Now, only smoke curled above the smoldering lodge, carrying, with it, the bitter scent of powder and burned flesh. Elias stood among the bodies, boots sinking into trampled snow, his breath rising like ghosts in the cold. His hands trembled still, though no rifle weighed them down anymore. He had killed. And lived. Ayoka moved past him, her braids heavy with frost, her bow still clutched though no enemies remained. She did not look at Elias at first, only at the broken ground, the trails of blood that led nowhere, but the stillness of death. When her eyes finally rose to his, there was no softness, only a measured respect, as one survivor to another. "You chose to fight with us," she said, her voice roughened by smoke and grief. "But remember, this world was not made for our paths, to walk side by side." Her words were both warning and acknowledgement, carved sharp as flint. Elias bowed his head. He had no reply that would not ring false. Chenoa emerged from the shadows of the lodge, dragging a blanket over her shoulders. She had fought with fire in her veins, and yet now her gaze was different, still guarded, but not with the same hatred that once burned in it. When her eyes swept over Elias, there was a flicker of something he had not seen before. Not trust, not quite forgiveness, but the faintest recognition of his courage. "You're still alive," she muttered, almost begrudging. "That is something." For Chenoa it was more than enough. But it was Winona who lingered. She stood close to Elias, her dark eyes reflecting both the rising sun and the wreckage around them. Snowflakes clung to her hair, melting against the heat of her skin. She did not speak at first. Instead, she let her hand drift, almost uncertain, until her fingers brushed his. The contact was brief, delicate, but it sent a shiver through Elias more than the night's cold had managed. No words were needed. The silence between them carried everything they could not say. He wanted to stay, to remain in the shadow of that lodge, to live among their fire and silence, to carve a place in their world that was never meant for him. But he knew better. His presence was danger. His path was back to the ranch, back to the fences and the loneliness that now seemed unbearable. So he saddled his horse as dawn spread across the peaks. The mountains loomed high, eternal witnesses to the night's savagery, their snowfields, marked forever in his memory. Ahioka stood with her arms crossed, watching him. Chenoa stayed near the lodge, her blanket tight around her frame. Winona stood closest of all, her breath a fragile cloud in the cold. Elias placed his boot in the stirrup, then paused. For a heartbeat, the world felt like it was holding its breath. Winona stepped forward. Her hand found his again, firmer this time, her thumb brushing his knuckles. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Only that look. Burning, sorrowful, forbidden. And then she let go. Elias swung into the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked at them one last time, the sisters who had taken him in, mistrusted him, fought beside him, and changed him. He had come to them as a boy carrying guilt. He left as a man scarred by blood, tested by fire, marked forever by a night that would not fade from his heart. The horse moved beneath him, hooves crunching in the frost. With every step away from the lodge, he felt the weight of something breaking inside, yet also something awakening. The mountains swallowed him, their peaks cutting the sky in jagged silence. Behind him, 3 sisters stood in the snow, alive, fierce, unbroken. Ahead of him, only an uncertain road and the knowledge that he would never again be the same. The rising sun set the peaks ablaze with light, turning the world into fire and ice. Elias did not look back. but he felt their presence in every breath of wind, in every echo of hooves across the frozen earth. That was my story. If it reached, you tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me where in the world you're listening from.